The real history of the assassin order, secrets of the world's first silent killers. A world before the weight of kingdoms pressed their names into stone, before maps carved borders, before chronicles chose which stories deserved to survive. In that unrecorded dawn, when power moved in the open and truth hid in the dark, another force stirred quietly beneath the surface of history. A brotherhood without banners, a creed without thrones, a shadow born not from chaos, but from purpose. In the high deserts and narrow alleys where faith met fear, men and women learned to move like the wind that slips between mountains. They studied the patterns of rulers, the hunger of empires, the whispered needs of the powerless. Some say they were rebels. Others call them zealots. But beneath every version of their tale lies something older, the idea that when tyranny rises, so too must those willing to cut a path back to balance. Their name would echo across continents, sometimes cursed, sometimes revered, always misunderstood. The Assassin Order, a lineage woven from discipline, devotion, and the dangerous belief that one blade, placed with precision, could change the course of the world. Legends paint them as ghosts. Historians call them outlaws. Yet in the space between those extremes lives the truth. They were human, shaped by the same choices that shape us all: fear, loyalty, grief, conviction. They watched dynasties grow heavy with pride. They witnessed prophets fall to politics and warlords rise from the dust. And from hidden fortresses perched on impossible cliffs, they crafted a silent craft that unsettled emperors and reshaped realms. This is not the story of killers in hoods. It is the story of a philosophy sharpened into action, a code born in secrecy but sustained by belief. A shadow that walked beside history, unseen yet undeniable, and whose legacy still lingers, like a breath of cold wind trailing across the centuries. Chapter 1: The Cradle of Hidden Faiths. Before empires rose to seal their power in stone, the mountains of Persia carried a silence that felt older than belief itself. Wind moved through the steep valleys like a quiet warning, whispering against the cliffs where small, isolated communities clung to life. It was here, in this rugged world of shifting loyalties and spiritual disputes, that a new chapter in human conviction began to take form. A chapter born not from wealth or armies, but from faith pressed into a corner and the courage required to defend it. In the 11th century, the Islamic world was splitting along deep, ideological lines. Caliphates argued over rightful succession. Scholars debated interpretations of divine law. Rulers used religion as both shield and sword, pulling alliances together and tearing them apart. At the center of these disputes stood the Ismailis, a branch of Shia Islam whose beliefs challenged the authority of more dominant dynasties. And from within the Ismailis, a smaller, fiercely devoted faction emerged, the Nizaris. Their devotion to the lineage of Imam Nizar marked them as outsiders, heretics to some, threats to others. But among themselves, they held tightly to the hope that truth could survive even when pressed by powerful hands. The world around them was not kind to dissent. Seljuk sultans, with armies spread across Persia and Syria, enforced their rule with heavy precision. Their leaders viewed the Nizaris not as rivals, but as sparks that could ignite rebellion. The Nizaris, scattered across small communities, felt the weight of this fear. Families learned to worship quietly. Teachers carried knowledge in whispers. Faith became something guarded, not to keep it sacred, but to keep it alive. Yet isolation has a strange way of shaping purpose. When a belief is hunted, its followers learn to walk softly, to organize discreetly, and to protect one another with a loyalty forged by necessity. In remote valleys and mountain strongholds, this transformation began. The Nizaris did not seek conquest. They sought survival. But survival in a world of vast armies and suspicious rulers required more than prayer or secrecy. It required strategy, and a leader who could see beyond the limits of the moment. That leader was Hasan-i Sabbah. History remembers him with a mix of fear and fascination. Some describe him as a scholar turned revolutionary. Others claim he was a mystic with unshakable conviction. What survives beyond myth is a simple truth. Hassan understood that ideas, when threatened, must be defended not only with words, but with precision and structure. And so he looked to the mountains, to Alamut. a seemingly impossible fortress suspended between earth and sky, and began shaping a new order that would protect his people against forces far larger than themselves. Alamut was not chosen for beauty, though it possessed a harsh elegance. It was selected because it offered what the Nizaris lacked, a place that could not be easily taken, a vantage point from which time and terrain worked in their favor. The fortress rested on a narrow ridge, its paths twisting like threads of stone. To reach it was to confront the mountain itself. To defend it required only a few disciplined guardians. And from its heights, Hassan saw the future of his persecuted community. Here, in this remote sanctuary, the Nizaris forged a new identity. They studied philosophy, theology, and strategy. They trained their bodies with the same devotion they used to train their minds. They learned patience, discipline, and silence, not as tactics of war, but as tools of survival. For every enemy that marched with banners, 10 more whispered decrees for their destruction. And so Hassan created an order prepared to answer threats in ways the medieval world had never witnessed. As persecution intensified, the Nizaris realized that conventional battles would lead only to ruin. They had no armies to field, no cavalry to send sweeping across plains. Their strength lay not in numbers, but in precision. And so emerged a new form of defense, one that relied on courage, closeness, and unwavering resolve. An act carried out not on the battlefield, but in the heart of an enemy's stronghold. A single strike meant not to sow chaos, but to prevent it. Over time, this method, practiced with extreme discipline, became the defining mark of the Nizari defenders. Outsiders called it fanaticism, enemies called it terror. But to the Nizaris, it was survival shaped into action, a last line of resistance against extermination. Their most devoted members trained for years, learning to slip through guarded cities, to move unseen, and to place themselves in mortal danger for the safety of their people. These were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were guardians who used their lives as shields. Across the Islamic world, rulers began to hear rumors, stories of silent figures who approached powerful men without fear, stories of missions carried out with careful planning and absolute resolve, stories that bent toward legend faster than memory could contain them. Some chroniclers, writing from the safety of distant courts, exaggerated these tales until they became monstrous. They painted the Nizaris as killers without conscience, operating in dreamlike stupor. But those who faced them understood something far more unsettling. These men acted not from madness, but from devotion. And devotion is difficult to defeat. As decades passed, the Nizaris strengthened their hold on several mountaintop fortresses across Persia and Syria. Each one served not only as a defensive sanctuary, but as a school for strategy and belief. Here, generations learned the principles of loyalty, sacrifice, and discipline. Their world was fragile, surrounded by enemies on every side. But within those walls, a sense of purpose grew, the knowledge that survival required both intellect and action. Yet the true heart of the Nizari story was not the blade, it was the creed behind it. A creed built on the idea that faith must be protected not only for the present generation, but for those yet to come. In a time when empires expanded through conquest, the Nizaris held a deeper, quieter ambition, to preserve a path of belief that might otherwise fade into the dust of forgotten conflicts. This mission carried weight. It demanded sacrifice. And it required an order capable of stepping into the shadows where conventional power could not reach. As their influence spread, so did their reputation. Allies admired their discipline. Enemies feared their resolve. But beneath all the stories, beneath the legends that travelers carried across continents, lay a simpler truth. The Nizaris had become something the medieval world rarely saw, a community that transformed vulnerability into strength, persecution into purpose, and isolation into innovation. In the end, this was the cradle of a hidden faith, a place where belief was both shield and forge, where mountains sheltered the seeds of a movement that would influence history far beyond its time. And as the world around them descended into wars of ambition and ideology, the Nizaris learned that sometimes the smallest groups carve the deepest marks into the memory of civilization. For when power seeks to crush a belief, that belief often grows sharper, more focused, and far more unforgettable. Chapter 2. Hasan-i Sabbah's fierce vision. Before the world spoke his name with fear or fascination, Hasan-i Sabbah walked the roads of the Islamic Empire as a seeker. Dust clung to his robes, not from exile, but from the long journey toward understanding. He lived in a world where power shifted like unsettled sand, where scholars debated the will of God, and where rulers guarded their authority with suspicion. Yet through all these movements, Hassan held a single, burning truth within him. That belief was not meant to bend under the weight of politics. It was meant to stand firm, even when the world around it fractured. His early life left few traces in written histories, but the echoes that survive reveal a young man of sharp intellect and deeper conviction. Born in Qum, raised in the atmosphere of scholars and theologians, Hassan grew up surrounded by the shifting debates of the age. His mind sharpened on the arguments of philosophers. His spirit formed in the tension between faith and reason. And as he matured, he began to sense that the world he lived in was moving toward a breaking point, one in which truth would need defenders willing to step beyond the familiar. Travel shaped him further. He moved through cities where bazaars thrived beneath the watchful eyes of soldiers. He studied under teachers who spoke cautiously, mindful of ears loyal to the Seljuk elite. He watched how common people carried their faith quietly, as though protecting a small flame from the storm winds of political power. It was here, in these shared silences, that Hassan's vision deepened. He saw a world where belief had become fragile, where those who thought differently were pushed into the shadows. And he knew that if truth was to survive, it needed a sanctuary, a place untouched by ambition, guarded by discipline, and guided by clarity of purpose. Yet vision alone could not reshape the world. Hassan needed a foundation strong enough to resist armies, corruption, and fear. That foundation revealed itself when he reached the mountains of Daylam. There, rising above the landscape with the starkness of a final judgment, stood Alamut, a fortress perched on a narrow ridge, suspended like a hawk's nest between earth and sky. To most travelers, it was an unreachable dream. To Hassan, it was destiny carved in stone. Alamut was more than a fortress. It was a symbol waiting to awaken. Its paths wound upward through unforgiving slopes. Its cliffs formed natural walls that no conventional army could easily breach. From its high vantage point, a watcher could see danger long before it arrived. But beneath its physical strength lay something deeper, the promise of a refuge where ideas could be protected, strengthened, and passed on to future generations. Hassan understood this the moment he saw it. And from that moment, he committed himself not to conquest, but to transformation. Securing Alamut was not a feat of violence, as some later legends claimed. It was a triumph of patience, persuasion, and strategy. Hassan entered the region quietly, building trust, gaining support, and demonstrating the value of his vision. Slowly, he wove himself into the fabric of the mountain community. He learned their concerns, their needs, their fears. And when the time came, he took possession of the fortress without spilling unnecessary blood, a testament to the force of intellect over brute strength. Alamut became his, not through domination, but through the careful art of influence. Once within its stone walls, Hassan began to shape the heart of the order that would one day shake empires. His leadership was calm but unyielding. His expectations were strict, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. He believed that discipline was the shield behind which truth could endure. And so he created an environment where the mind, body, and spirit were sharpened equally. Students arrived from distant regions, drawn by whispers of a leader whose conviction felt like a gidding flame. They found in Alamut no luxury, no indulgence, no distraction. Instead, they encountered a life carved from purpose. Days were filled with study, theology, mathematics, philosophy, strategy. Nights were devoted to reflection and silent contemplation. In this rhythm, the students shed the noise of the outside world. They learned to listen to their thoughts, to understand their convictions, and to recognize the weight of the mission they were being prepared for. Hassan's presence shaped everything around him. Chroniclers described him as solitary, disciplined, and deeply principled. He lived simply, refusing wealth or comfort. His authority came not from fear, but from the clarity of his belief. Those who followed him did so not because they were coerced, but because they sensed that his vision offered something rare, a path that demanded sacrifice, yet promised a legacy beyond the reach of worldly rulers. Under Hassan's guidance, Alamut became more than a fortress. It became a sanctuary where persecuted believers found safety, a school where future leaders learned the art of patience, a forge where resilience was tempered in silence. From its heights, the Nizari community grew stronger, more unified, and more capable of defending itself against the storms gathering across the Islamic world. But the world outside did not rest. Seljuk sultans, alarmed by the growing influence of the Nizaris, intensified their pressure. Armies marched, cities trembled, courts whispered of the threat rising in the mountains. And through all of this, Hassan remained unshaken. He understood that power often feared what it could not control. He also understood that a new form of resistance was required, one that relied not on numbers, but on absolute precision and unwavering devotion. From this understanding emerged the specialized protectors who would become the heart of the Nizari defense. They trained under Hassan's direct oversight, learning to navigate danger with calm and purpose. To outsiders, they would one day be known as assassins, but within Alamut, they were guardians, individuals who pledged themselves to safeguarding the community, even at the cost of their own lives. Their actions, carried out with discipline and conviction, sent ripples through the political landscapes of Persia and Syria. Courts grew uneasy, rulers slept lightly. And yet, for the Nizaris, these acts were not gestures of terror, but of survival. Each mission served a single purpose: to shield a vulnerable people from annihilation. As the order solidified, Hassan remained its steady core. He rarely left Alamut. He did not seek glory. Instead, he watched over his community with the vigilance of a shepherd guarding his flock against wolves. His fierce vision guided every decision, a belief that truth, once chosen, must be lived with devotion, defended with courage, and carried with humility. In the quiet strength of his leadership, the Nizari order found its first heartbeat, one strong enough to echo across valleys, unsettled kingdoms, and distant centuries. For in a world shaped by conquest and ambition, Hasan-i Sabbah proved that conviction, when anchored in purpose, could carve a path through even the harshest of storms. Chapter 3: Alamut, Fortress of Revelation. High above the restless plains, where the wind carried the distant echoes of marching armies, Alamut stood unmoved, a solitary citadel sculpted into the spine of the mountains. To those who approached from below, it appeared almost unreal, suspended between cloud and stone, guarded by the very cliffs that shaped it. But for those who entered its gates, Alamut became something deeper. It was not merely a stronghold of defense. It was a place where belief took form, where the scattered hopes of a persecuted people were forged into a disciplined and unified purpose. The climb to Alamut tested every traveler long before he reached its gates. Narrow paths clung to the edges of steep ridges. Loose stones shifted beneath even the most careful steps. The air thinned, sharpening breath and thought alike. Many who made the ascent later said the journey itself felt like a rite, as though the mountain judged the resolve of each soul who sought its sanctuary. And perhaps it did, for those who arrived without conviction rarely stayed long. Those who arrived with doubt found it stripped away. In this isolated realm, surrounded by sky, faith became something that could be felt like the weight of the wind against the skin. Within the fortress walls, life moved according to rhythms very different from the world below. The noise of markets, the tension of political courts, the shifting tides of war, none of these could breach the calm that ruled Alamut's heights. Instead, the citadel carried the stillness of a monastery. Narrow corridors echoed with quiet footsteps. Students moved with measured pace, as though each motion were part of a larger, unspoken ritual. Even the gardens, though vibrant with life, held an atmosphere of deliberate peace, as if every leaf had been placed with intention. These gardens were more than decoration. They symbolized paradise, a living reminder of the divine truths the Nizari sought to protect. Fruit trees spread soft shade across terrace paths. Small streams, guided by careful channels, whispered alongside stone walkways. Flowers in vivid reds and golds bloomed in the thin mountain air. To the initiates, this beauty served a purpose. It grounded them. In a world where threats waited beyond every horizon, the gardens reminded them what they fought to preserve, a vision of harmony, knowledge, and spiritual clarity. Beyond the gardens stood the libraries, the intellectual heart of Alamut. Their walls held manuscripts gathered from across centuries, treatises on philosophy, works of theology, records of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, language. Here, truth was not confined to a single discipline. It spread across shelves like a map of human curiosity. Scholars copied texts with meticulous care, knowing that the knowledge within them might one day vanish from the outside world. To walk through these halls was to feel the presence of generations whispering through parchment. Each scroll carried the weight of civilizations. Each ink stroke fought against the forgetting that accompanies war and conquest. Studying within these rooms shaped the minds of every initiate. Their days began with lessons in theology, exploring the deeper meanings of divine unity and the hidden layers of spiritual interpretation. Afternoons were filled with practical study, languages, mathematics, poetry, geography. To protect the community, one needed understanding, not just strength. For Hasan-i Sabbah believed that knowledge sharpened strategy, refined judgment, and strengthened the spirit as much as discipline strengthened the body. But Alamut was not solely a sanctuary for intellect. It was also a crucible for physical precision and skill. Training grounds stretched across flat terraces carved into the mountainside. Here, young initiates learned to move silently, to climb with confidence, to study the patterns of terrain. Their instructors taught them how to blend into a crowd, how to vanish in plain sight, how to read the shift of a soldier's stance or the tension in a guard's gaze. These lessons were not taught through harshness, but through repetition, patience, and careful observation. Each motion, each breath, each step became a form of discipline, linking body and mind into a single, focused purpose. Among these practices, the blade held a place of particular reverence. It was never raised without reason. It was never used impulsively. Initiates learned to see it not as a weapon of destruction, but as an extension of resolve. They studied the balance, the edge, the movement of steel through air. They practiced until the blade felt like part of their own being, steady, precise, controlled. Through this discipline, they discovered that true strength did not lie in force, but in intention. Yet the most profound training at Alamut took place not in the gardens, the libraries, or the terraces, but within the quiet corners where initiates faced themselves. Silence was one of the fortress's greatest teachers. In that silence, doubts arose. In that silence, truths sharpened. In that silence, loyalty deepened. Each student learned to reflect on the weight of his choices, the depth of his conviction, and the meaning of sacrifice. For the Nizari brotherhood demanded devotion that reached beyond fear. Their mission required clarity that could not be shaken by threats or temptation. Under Hasan-i Sabbah's guidance, these practices wove together into a single philosophy, one that blended spiritual purpose with strategic necessity. Alamut became the heart of this philosophy, a place where belief shaped action and action protected belief. Here, individuals learned that every deed carried responsibility, every mission held consequence, every moment of hesitation or carelessness could determine the survival of their entire people. And so, the silent methods of the Brotherhood emerged. They were not designed for chaos, but for precision. They were not born from aggression, but from defense. Each act was carried out with forethought, built on layers of observation, preparation, and discipline. Outsiders later whispered dark tales, weaving fantasies about mysticism and blind devotion. But within Alamut's walls, the truth was clear. Those who acted did so with full awareness, guided by faith and bound by a loyalty stronger than fear. As years passed, Alamut's reputation grew far beyond the mountains. Rulers in distant courts heard rumors of a fortress that no army could take, a community that no threat could silence. Some called it a nest of rebellion. Others called it a stronghold of wisdom. But none could deny that Alamut had become a force woven into the fabric of the medieval world, a place where ideas were protected with greater fierceness than treasure, where knowledge was guarded as fiercely as lives, and where belief became action in its most refined form. In the end, Alamut was more than stone, more than fortress, more than refuge. It was a revelation, a place where a persecuted people reclaimed the right to shape their destiny, a place where the bond between blade, belief, and loyalty formed the core of a legacy that would echo through centuries. Chapter 4. The Birth of the Fida'i Warriors. In the high chambers of Alamut, where stone met sky and silence shaped the will of men, a new kind of warrior began to take form. They did not resemble the soldiers who marched across the empires of the age. They carried no shields, no banners, no armor polished for the gaze of kings. Instead, they carried discipline in their breath, certainty in their steps, and a devotion sharpened so finely it could cut through fear itself. These were the Fida'i, the devoted ones, whose purpose flowed deeper than survival, broader than ambition, and more enduring than any throne they challenged. The world below Alamut moved according to the might of armies. Kingdoms rose on the backs of cavalry charges. Fortunes changed with the swing of siege engines. Commanders measured their power in the number of men they could send into the dust of the battlefield. But Hasan-i Sabbah understood something that shifted the balance of this ancient world. He knew that armies were loud. They were predictable. Their movements could be tracked, blocked, or crushed beneath larger forces. A single warrior, however, one who moved with absolute focus, could slip through the cracks of empire, striking in places where legions could never reach. To become such a warrior required more than strength. It required the ability to give up the comforts of an ordinary life, to place duty above desire, to understand that purpose could stretch beyond the length of one lifetime. The Fidaïs learned this first lesson long before they touched a blade. In the quiet halls of Alamut, instructors introduced them not to weapons, but to the weight of commitment. Through meditation, reflection, and long nights spent alone with their thoughts, the initiates discovered whether their resolve could endure the demands of the path ahead. Only those whose spirits remained steady entered the next stage. They studied languages so they could move unseen across borders. They learned to blend into crowds, to shift posture, voice, and manners until they became part of the background. Their teachers led them through the bustling markets of Daylam in disguise, forcing them to observe without drawing attention. They practiced walking as merchants, speaking as scholars, moving as craftsmen. Disappearance became an art, not of vanishing into shadows, but of becoming so ordinary that no one looked twice. Alongside these skills came lessons in target psychology. The Fida'i needed to know far more than where a man stood. They needed to understand what he feared, how he thought, and which moments left him exposed. They studied patterns, the routines of rulers, the tendencies of guards, the weaknesses of court politics. Instructors taught them to see the world as a series of threads, each one representing a decision, a habit, a vulnerability. When woven together, these threads revealed the precise point where a single act could shift the entire fabric of power. The Fida'i trained not in groups, but in silence. Each man carried his mission alone, learning to trust himself more deeply than he trusted the ground beneath his feet. Their exercises were exacting, climbing sheer cliffs before sunrise, navigating narrow ledges where one misstep meant death, running long distances without leaving visible traces. These challenges were not meant to harden them in the way armies hardened recruits. They were meant to refine the mind, teaching each warrior to remain calm even when breath burned, muscles trembled, and danger pressed close enough to taste. When they finally reached the stage of blade work, the lessons shifted from physical technique to the philosophy behind each movement. The weapon itself was simple, usually a dagger, small enough to conceal, sharp enough to deliver swift certainty. Fida'i instructors taught their students to hold it not with aggression, but with intention. A blade, they said, was not for spectacle. It was for one moment, chosen with care, carried out with precision. Any unnecessary motion diluted its purpose. The willingness of the Fida'i to give their lives was not born from recklessness. It grew from clarity. Each man understood that the survival of the Nizari community depended on actions that defied the rules of warfare. A Fida'i's life was offered not as waste, but as the most profound expression of loyalty, an offering that protected thousands by risking one. This devotion unsettled rulers in ways armies never could. A soldier who might flee or negotiate posed little threat. A Fida'i, committed fully to his mission, dissolved the very structure of fear, on which most leaders built their authority. As their training continued, the reputation of these men began to seep quietly into the world beyond the mountains. Rumors traveled with caravans, whispered by merchants who had passed through unfamiliar paths. Stories reached palaces, carried by trembling envoys uncertain whether they had seen truth or illusion. Some spoke of warriors who appeared from nowhere, carrying out their task with ghost-like calm before disappearing into crowds. Others described moments when oppression faltered because one silent figure stepped forward with unwavering purpose. The Fida'i did not seek fame, but the legends grew nonetheless. In an age when military might was measured in thousands, the idea that a lone figure could alter the course of kingdoms felt impossible. Yet time and time again, the Fida'i proved that power did not always march behind trumpets. Sometimes it walked in silence through the heart of a guarded palace at dawn. Sometimes it waited patiently for the precise moment when a tyrant's confidence became his blind spot. In these moments, the world saw the truth that Hasan-i Sabbah had recognized long before. Precision could achieve what armies could not. For the Fida'i, each mission was a thread woven into the greater tapestry of survival. Their actions were not random, nor were they ruled by emotion. They were chosen carefully, often to prevent greater bloodshed. By removing one dangerous figure, a governor known for violent purges, a commander preparing to crush Nizari communities, a ruler whose ambitions threatened countless innocent lives, the Fida'i protected entire regions. Their methods became a form of political pressure in a world where negotiation often failed and justice rarely reached the powerful. Yet despite the growing fear they inspired, the essence of the Fida'i remained rooted in service. Their lives were not shaped by glory, but by the quiet understanding that devotion required sacrifice. They lived simply. They trained relentlessly. They carried the weight of their missions with solemn acceptance. And when the time came, they acted with the calm certainty born from years of preparation. As their presence spread across deserts, mountains, and distant cities, the medieval world began to understand a truth that unsettled kings and caliphs alike. No fortress was too heavily guarded. No throne was too distant. For the Fida'i proved that in the vast landscapes of empire, a single determined soul could step into the current of history and redirect its flow. In the end, these warriors became more than protectors of the Nizaris. They became symbols of a different kind of power, one born from discipline, conviction, and the belief that even in an age ruled by armies, the quiet courage of one devoted individual could reshape the fate of nations. Chapter 5. The First Strikes of Defiance. Before the world learned to fear the silent figures descending from Alamut, the Nizari stood on the edge of extinction. Their communities were scattered, their beliefs condemned, and their survival balanced on a fragile line drawn between mountains and hostile empires. In those early years, the order understood a truth carved by hardship. If they did not act, they would disappear. And so their first missions emerged not from ambition or conquest, but from necessity, quiet acts of defiance shaped to protect a people surrounded by forces far larger than themselves. The medieval world beyond the Nizari strongholds moved with the heavy certainty of armies and sultans. Cities swore loyalty to distant rulers. Governors tightened their hands on local populations. Religious authorities issued edicts that shaped the fate of entire regions with a single decree. In this world, the Nizaris had no representation, no armies to defend them, no courts to hear their pleas. To powerful rulers, they were a minority sect easily silenced. To many religious scholars, they were heretics whose teachings deserved eradication. And to soldiers loyal to the Seljuks, they were little more than targets. From the ridges of Alamut, Hasan-i Sabbah watched these dangers gather like storm clouds on the horizon. He understood that conventional resistance would only hasten destruction. The Nizaris could not afford open battle. Their numbers were too few, their resources too thin, their enemies too entrenched. Instead, he turned to precision, a strategy that struck at the heart of threats rather than their armies. Each strike would be measured, deliberate, and symbolic. Each act would speak for those who had no voice. The first missions were shaped with extreme care. They targeted men whose power reached into Nizari communities with ruthless intent. These were not ordinary officials. They were governors who ordered mass arrests, generals who planned campaigns of eradication, and religious authorities whose sermons called for the elimination of the sect. In Hassan's view, these figures represented the roots of violence. Remove them, and the storm would weaken. Allow them to continue, and the Nizaris would vanish. Selecting a target required long observation. Fida'i operatives spent months moving through towns disguised as laborers, scribes, merchants, or travelers. They memorized the rhythms of the governor's residence, the schedules of his guards, the habits he repeated unconsciously, the tilt of his head when he walked through a crowd, the hour at which he took counsel, the path he followed when visiting the mosque. Nothing was left to chance. The Nizaris understood that precision was the strongest ally of the powerless. When the moment arrived, the execution was calm, unhurried. The Fida'i did not strike from shadows or flee into darkness. He acted in daylight, standing before his target as a symbol of accountability. This was deliberate. Daylight stripped the act of mystery. It forced the world to witness it. It announced that a people long oppressed had found a means of resistance. And though the Fida'i rarely survived his mission, his sacrifice carried a message that traveled far beyond the courtyard or street where the act took place. One of the earliest recorded strikes occurred in the bustling city of Isfahan, where a powerful Seljuk vizier had embraced harsh measures against the Nizaris. He believed fear would quiet them, but he misjudged the resolve shaped by years of persecution. A lone Fida'i, disguised as a servant, approached the vizier during a public gathering. The blade flashed only once. Witnesses stood frozen, caught between shock and disbelief. And when the vizier fell, the Fida'i did not flee. He stood still, allowing the moment to speak its truth before guards overwhelmed him. In that stillness, an idea took root across Persia. The powerless were no longer defenseless. This pattern repeated in the months and years that followed. A general known for burning Nizari villages found himself approached by a quiet traveler in a marketplace. A governor infamous for imprisoning Nizari scholars was struck down during morning prayers. A preacher whose sermons fueled violence fell in the presence of his own congregation. These acts sent tremors through the fabric of political life. Rulers who once dismissed the Nizaris now reviewed their schedules with caution. Guards doubled their vigilance. Walls were raised thicker, gates reinforced, and ministers chose their words with greater care. Yet despite the fear these missions generated, the Nizaris were not indiscriminate. They did not pursue vengeance for its own sake. Each target was chosen to prevent a specific threat, to neutralize an individual whose power posed direct danger to their survival. In a world accustomed to bloodshed and conquest, such precision felt unfamiliar, but it also revealed the depth of thought behind their actions. They were not agents of chaos. They were protectors acting within the narrow space left to them by history. The psychological impact of these early strikes reshaped the relationship between the Nizaris and the ruling powers. Hostility remained, but it was tempered by caution. Even rulers who despised the sect recognized that aggression carried risk. Their attempts to crush the Nizaris could result in consequences delivered not by armies, but by a single determined individual. This unspoken tension created a fragile breathing space, a small but vital gap in which the Nizari communities could regroup, strengthen, and stabilize. For the Fidais themselves, these missions carried profound emotional weight. They were not driven by hatred. Their devotion came from a sense of responsibility, a belief that their lives could shield their families, teachers, and communities from destruction. Each man accepted his fate without ceremony. He spent his final nights in meditation, preparing his spirit as carefully as he prepared his disguise. There was no room for fear, only clarity. The aftermath of these acts echoed across medieval chronicles. Court historians wrote of the hidden hand that reached from the mountains. Soldiers whispered of men who walked toward death without hesitation. Priests debated whether the Nizaris were possessed by unwavering faith or dangerous conviction. But amid all these interpretations, one truth endured. The Nizaris had found a way to survive in a world determined to erase them. These first strikes did more than protect a vulnerable people. They reshaped the political landscape. They demonstrated that rulers, no matter how powerful, were not untouchable. They established an unwritten rule across deserts and palaces alike, a reminder that oppression carried a cost. And they proved that courage, when paired with precision, could shift the balance of history. In the quiet records of Alamut, these early missions were remembered not as acts of terror, but as the opening breaths of a community refusing to disappear. They were the first signs of a truth the medieval world had never confronted, that sometimes the most profound defiance comes not from armies, but from a single figure who walks toward danger with unwavering conviction. Chapter 6: Saladin and the Unfinished Shadow War. Long before his name became legend, before poets carried his victories across kingdoms and Crusader chroniclers shaped him into a symbol of honor, Saladin lived with the constant weight of danger pressing against the edges of his growing empire. He commanded armies that stretched across deserts and cities, yet even he understood that power, no matter how vast, could not shield him from every shadow. And among those shadows walked the one force that no commander, not even the great Sultan of Egypt and Syria, could ever fully predict: the Fida'i of Alamut. Saladin had risen from the turmoil of fractured dynasties and foreign invasions. His reputation carried a mixture of respect, fear, and fascination. He was the commander who unified Muslim lands, the leader who reclaimed Jerusalem, the man who turned back European crusaders with brilliance rather than cruelty. But his ascent to power placed him squarely on the path of the Nizaris, whose territories stretched across regions he sought to unify. Their interests collided like opposing winds meeting in the mountain passes, unseen, yet forceful enough to reshape the landscape. The first encounters between Saladin and the Assassin Order did not begin with diplomacy. They began with tension. Saladin saw the Nizaris as a threat to his authority, a faction that could not be controlled by the usual tools of governance. Their methods crossed the boundaries of conventional war. Their influence slipped through cracks in the political order. Their reach extended toward individuals rather than territories. To a man reshaping the map of the Middle East, this was a kind of danger impossible to ignore. His attempts to subdue Nizari regions pushed the order into a defensive posture, and defense, under Hasan-i Sabbah's legacy, meant precision. The Fida'i moved swiftly, guided by leadership hardened by decades of persecution. Saladin, despite his tactical brilliance, was not immune to their attention. He had marched into their world. Now their world marched quietly toward him. One night, beneath a pale moon that cast faint silver across the tents of his army, Saladin faced the first direct sign of their presence. Guards patrolled the perimeter. Torches flickered in the cool desert wind. Horses stirred uneasily. Yet none of this prevented a Fida'i from reaching the heart of the camp. Accounts from the period describe a figure slipping past watchful eyes, moving with the slow certainty of someone who had studied every breath of the night. Saladin awoke to find a dagger planted in the ground beside his bed. Its blade caught the moonlight in a narrow, cold line. Attached to its hilt was a simple message, not of war, not of insult, but of warning. The Fida'i had entered and departed without harming him. It was a gesture that revealed something deeper than hostility. It demonstrated that even the most protected man in the Muslim world was reachable. When this news spread among his soldiers, unease moved through the ranks like a ripple through water. How could anyone breach the tents of the great Saladin? How could a single figure defy the vigilance of an entire army? Yet this was the realm where the assassins thrived, a world where the quiet step carried more power than the charge of cavalry, where a single blade in the dark held greater meaning than 1,000 arrows striking at dawn. Saladin tightened his defenses. He adjusted his camp layouts. He changed his sleeping arrangements, placing trusted guards close at hand. But the Fida'i came again. Chronicles differ on the number of attempts, but they agree on the outcome. None reached his heart, yet all reached his awareness. These encounters revealed not weakness, but limits, the understanding that military might could not fully secure a ruler against threats invisible to traditional warfare. For the Nizaris, the goal was never the removal of Saladin himself. Their intent lay in reminding him that aggression toward their strongholds would carry consequences. Their methods carved messages more lasting than diplomatic letters. And slowly, the weight of these encounters began shaping the decisions of the Sultan. As months passed, the tension shifted into a fragile, strategic equilibrium. Saladin, whose life had been shaped by battles against Crusaders, recognized that a prolonged conflict with the Nizaris would drain resources and destabilize regions he needed united. The Order, for its part, understood that Saladin's leadership had the potential to bring stability to lands long torn by division. Neither side trusted the other fully, but both recognized that open hostility would cost more than it gained. And so an uneasy peace emerged, not written on parchment, not sealed with signatures, but shaped by necessity. Envoys moved quietly between Saladin's court and Nizari representatives. Messages were exchanged with cautious tone. The Fida'i ceased their missions against him. Saladin halted his efforts to subdue their territories. This understanding never grew into alliance or friendship. It remained a truce formed from mutual awareness, a recognition that each held influence in realms beyond the other's reach. Chronicles written by Saladin's biographers present these events with careful restraint. They speak of mysterious intrusions and unexplainable dangers. They mention the assassins with a mix of fear and respect common among rulers of the age. Persian and Syrian sources, viewed through the lens of later historians, offer glimpses of a confrontation that felt more like a dance than a war, a series of movements shaped by miscalculation, surprise, and eventual adaptation. What remains consistent across accounts is the sense of revelation these encounters created. Saladin, a general accustomed to facing armies head-on, learned that certain forces could not be met with cavalry or steel. The Nizaris, operating from the heights of Alamut and its sister fortresses, demonstrated that influence flowed through unexpected channels. They taught the medieval world a subtle truth, that power did not always roar across the battlefield. Sometimes it whispered beside a sleeping ruler, leaving a blade planted where his heart might have been. This unfinished shadow war left impressions that outlived the men who shaped it. The stories carried through courts and caravans, inspiring awe and caution in equal measure. Some retold the attempts as failures, minimizing their significance. Others emphasized the fact that the greatest commander of the age had been touched not by steel, but by a message of restraint and warning. But beneath these interpretations lay the deeper meaning, presence. The Nizaris had made themselves impossible to ignore. The truce they forged did not erase the tension between their worlds. It merely created a space where survival balanced against ambition. And though Saladin's rise continued, though crusades raged and empires shifted, the memory of the silent figures who reached for him beneath moonlit skies remained part of his legend. For in the long narrative of the Assassin Order, this chapter stands as a testament to the reach of their philosophy, that the boundaries of power are never absolute, and that influence, when carried by conviction, can slip past armies, pass through guarded tent walls, and leave its mark not in conquest, but in the quiet recognition of vulnerability. Chapter 7. Crusaders Fear the Unseen Hand. When the Crusaders first crossed into the lands of the East, they entered a world far older and far more layered than the one they knew. They marched beneath banners embroidered with crosses, confident in their steel, their faith, and the tales that had carried them across seas. Yet nothing in their European chronicles had prepared them for the shadows that moved through these mountains, shadows that did not march, did not shout, did not declare war, yet shaped fear with greater force than any army. Among these shadows, one name rose again and again in Frankish whispers: the Assassins. To the Crusaders, they were not a sect or political faction. They were something else entirely, a mystery, a danger, a presence that eluded the logic of the battlefield. And when soldiers cannot understand a threat, they imagine it into something far greater than reality. The Crusaders, unfamiliar with the culture, beliefs, and history of the Nizaris, filled the gaps in their knowledge with superstition. Fear took root. And out of fear, myth began to grow. Frankish chroniclers described the Nizaris with a mix of fascination and horror. Some wrote that they practiced sorcery, slipping through the world like spirits untouched by physical laws. Others insisted they drank strange potions that erased fear and pain. There were tales of gardens filled with impossible pleasures, where young initiates were said to be transporting in dreams, promised paradise in exchange for obedience. These stories blended into a tapestry of exaggeration, a tapestry woven not from truth, but from the Crusaders' inability to understand a culture that hid its strength behind silence. The Crusaders had been raised on stories of saints, demons, and miracles. When they encountered a group whose methods defied their expectations, they turned to the only explanations they knew. The Nizaris became creatures of legend, supernatural enemies whose blades slipped through armor, whose footsteps left no trace, whose loyalty surpassed earthly reason. Tales carried across Crusader camps described Fida'i warriors as ghost-like figures who could appear in a tent at night and vanish before dawn. Some soldiers swore the assassins could walk through walls. Others claimed they did not bleed when struck. These illusions, absurd as they were, shaped the mindset of Crusader armies. Men who had survived battles against seasoned Muslim generals trembled at the thought of a single assassin slipping into their ranks. Commanders issued new security measures, stationing extra guards near their tents. Knights who had charged fearlessly against cavalry now hesitated to sleep. Even small noises, a shifting tent flap, a clink of metal, a gust of wind gained new, unsettling meaning. Rumor became a weapon sharper than iron. The legend of the assassins spread quickly. Crusader chroniclers, often unfamiliar with the inner workings of the Islamic world, repeated second-hand stories from frightened soldiers. They embellished details to entertain readers back home. They amplified fear to magnify their own bravery. In doing so, they built an image of the Nizaris as something more than human. One writer claimed the assassins trained their initiates through rituals involving narcotic drinks and illusions, making them believe they had tasted heaven itself. Another described elaborate feasts in hidden gardens, guarded by warriors immune to temptation or death. These stories traveled faster than armies, reaching Europe as distant echoes of a people misunderstood. Monks copied them into manuscripts. Priests repeated them in sermons. And soon, across the continent, the word assassin no longer referred to a sect of believers defending their existence. It meant something darker, more mythical, more terrifying. But behind these legends lay the quieter truth. The Nizaris did not possess supernatural abilities. Their power came from training, discipline, and the willingness to sacrifice themselves for the safety of their community. They did not slip through walls or reappear in places like spirits. They studied their targets meticulously, learning their patterns and vulnerabilities. They moved with patience, not magic, and their success, when measured beside the scale of medieval warfare, was limited, precise, controlled. Yet the Crusaders, unfamiliar with such tactics, misread these actions as witchcraft. Their world had taught them that enemies either fought in open lines or hid behind fortified walls. The idea that influence could travel through a single blade, carried by a single man, felt unnatural. It threatened their understanding of warfare, and so their fear magnified the Nizaris into a force beyond comprehension. As Crusader leaders rose to prominence, their encounters with the assassins further fueled the myths. Some received warnings carved into wood or placed beside their tents. Some witnessed sudden deaths of allies and assumed invisible hands behind them. The atmosphere of uncertainty grew. When commanders cannot predict a threat, their soldiers inherit the anxiety. And all across the Crusader encampments, men spoke in hushed tones of a presence that watched from the mountains. The Nizaris, aware of this growing mystique, did not rush to correct it. They understood that perception could shape strategy. The more uncertainty the Crusaders felt, the less likely they were to provoke the order. In this way, myth became a defensive barrier, a shield forged not from stone, but from imagination. And in an age where wars were often decided before the first arrow reached the sky, such a shield carried enormous value. Nevertheless, not all Crusaders believed the tales. Some, particularly those who spent longer periods in the region, recognized the exaggerations. They understood that the assassins were human, disciplined, loyal, and strategic, but human nonetheless. A few even visited Nizari territories under conditions of fragile peace, meeting leaders whose intelligence and calm demeanor dispelled the darkest rumors. But these voices were few, and their accounts rarely traveled as far as the fantastical stories that readers found more thrilling. In the long arc of the Crusades, the fear of the unseen hand shaped the psychology of war. The Crusaders learned to guard not only against armies, but against silence. They realized that danger did not always announce itself. It could step quietly across the boundary of night and leave its message where power felt most secure. By the time Europe fully absorbed these tales, the assassins had become symbols of mystery, figures standing at the border between myth and reality. Their name entered languages, evolving into a term that would survive long after the original brotherhood faded into history. Few Europeans understood who the Nizaris truly were. Fewer still knew the beliefs that shaped their actions, but all remembered the stories. And in those stories, one truth endured. In an age driven by faith, rumor, and spectacle, myth could wound deeper than steel. The Crusaders feared the unseen hand not because it was supernatural, but because it revealed that power did not always belong to the strongest army. Sometimes it belonged to those who moved quietly, guided not by numbers, but by conviction, and who proved, again and again, that the unknown can unsettle even the bravest of men. Chapter 8: The Legend of the Old Man of the Mountain. Long before European travelers set foot in the valleys beneath Alamut, the winds of rumor had already begun shaping a phantom. They carried fragments of truth mixed with shadows, weaving them into a legend so strange, so alluring, that it would outlive empires. In the courts of Europe, by firelight in distant castles, men spoke of a mysterious ruler known only as the Old Man of the Mountain, a figure who commanded unquestioning obedience, who ruled through enchanted visions, who sent out fearless warriors bound to him as if by spell. Yet behind this fantastical myth stood a very real man, Hasan-i Sabbah, a leader of intellect, conviction, and discipline so unshakable that his enemies mistook clarity for sorcery. The origins of the legend began with travelers who crossed the frontiers of the Islamic world in the 12th and 13th centuries. Merchants, diplomats, and adventurers made the dangerous journey eastward, seeking riches, alliances, or simply stories to bring home. But the further they traveled into unfamiliar mountains, the more they encountered a people who guarded their beliefs with a secrecy that Europeans struggled to interpret. The Nizaris lived far from the centers of Western influence, bound by a spiritual philosophy foreign to Latin Christendom. Their silent methods, their isolated fortresses, and their unwavering loyalty created an atmosphere of mystery. And where understanding faltered, imagination began its climb. European chroniclers recorded accounts filled with both awe and fear. They spoke of a remote citadel perched in the clouds, ruled by an ageless master whose word meant life or death. Some wrote that he trained youths by plunging them into dreams of paradise, promising heavenly reward for obedience. Others claimed he ruled a secret garden where illusions of bliss were crafted to bind the hearts of his followers. These stories created a portrait of a sorcerer king who manipulated minds from a throne of stone, a narrative more suited to legend than history. But beneath these exaggerated tales lay the unmistakable shape of Hasan-i Sabbah's leadership. He had transformed Alamut into a sanctuary of intellect and strategy, a place where discipline guided every action and devotion flowed not from fear, but from shared belief. His followers admired him because he embodied clarity in an age clouded by political turmoil. His commands were rooted in purpose, not indulgence. His authority derived from consistency, not cruelty. Yet these qualities, so rare in medieval politics, appeared almost supernatural to outsiders. The Europeans who visited Nizari lands encountered a society unlike any they had known. The Fida'i, trained in silence and precision, displayed discipline that astonished even seasoned knights. Their readiness to sacrifice themselves, their calm acceptance of death, and their loyalty to the order created the illusion of brainwashing to those who could not imagine devotion without enchantment. To crusaders who fought for land or glory, such commitment felt impossible. To Western chroniclers who had never witnessed a culture where spiritual conviction shaped every breath, it seemed unnatural. And so, to explain what they could not comprehend, they invented a story, a tale of gardens filled with intoxicating herbs, of youths enchanted into obedience, of a master who controlled their senses with promises of otherworldly pleasure. This story, repeated in courts and monasteries, became the legend of the Old Man of the Mountain. Marco Polo later carried it across continents, embellishing details until imagination overshadowed reality. In Europe, truth softened and myth hardened. Hasan-i Sabbah's name dissolved, replaced by a character shaped entirely by European fears and fascinations. Yet the real Hasan-i Sabbah ruled not through enchantment, but through a philosophy woven from clarity, knowledge, and strategy. He believed that order required discipline, that survival demanded precision, and that leadership meant embracing humility before the divine. He kept a life of remarkable austerity, rejecting riches, luxuries, and political theatrics. His followers respected him because he lived the ideals he preached. His authority came from consistency, not spectacle. In Alamut, devotion was cultivated through education, spiritual reflection, and shared struggle. Students studied theology, philosophy, language, mathematics, diplomacy. Their minds were sharpened long before their bodies were tested. Loyalty grew not through illusions, but through understanding, the understanding that their existence was threatened by forces far stronger than themselves. The bond between leader and follower, so misunderstood by Europeans, was rooted in mutual commitment to survival, justice, and purpose. To the Nizaris, Hassan was not an enchanted master, but a guide, someone who illuminated a path through the dense forest of medieval conflict. They followed him not because they were promised paradise, but because he gave them a reason to resist extinction. His teachings forged resilience. His leadership shaped unity. His fortress walls sheltered not fantasies, but communities that had nowhere else to turn. Still, the myth of the Old Man of the Mountain spread with a momentum that truth could not stop. Crusaders repeated it to justify their fears. Merchants repeated it to sell stories. Chroniclers repeated it to entertain courts. And as each retelling added new layers, Hassan became something entirely different in Western memory, a villain of imagination rather than a leader of history. But legends often reveal more about the storytellers than the subjects. The Europeans who shaped this tale lived in a world divided by faith, threatened by unknown cultures, and bewildered by unfamiliar forms of power. Faced with a people who fought without armies and leaders who commanded loyalty without force, they chose to understand through metaphor rather than accuracy. The result was a character whose shadow stretched far beyond Alamut's walls, a figure who symbolized the fears of a continent wrestling with change. Yet behind that shadow, the real Hasan-i Sabbah stood steadfast. His life was marked by devotion, not indulgence. His authority was shaped by knowledge, not enchantment. And his legacy, preserved in Nizari memory, reflected leadership grounded in principle and purpose. The myth obscured these truths, but could never erase them. For the story of the Old Man of the Mountain is ultimately a reminder of how history bends under the weight of misunderstanding. How a man of intellect can become a figure of legend, simply because the world beyond his mountains could not see the strength of conviction without imagining magic behind it. Chapter 9. Ritual, Loyalty, and Unseen Codes. High in the mountain strongholds, where the world's noise thinned into wind and stone, the inner life of the Nizari order moved with a rhythm outsiders never understood. While enemies imagined dark rites and whispered of mindless fanaticism, the truth unfolded in quieter spaces, in classrooms lit by oil lamps, in courtyards where students practiced measured breathwork, and in chambers where silence carried more authority than any shouted command. Here, discipline did not rise from fear. It rose from philosophy, shaped by the understanding that survival depended not on chaos, but on clarity. For the Nizaris, violence was not a first instinct, it was a last resort. Initiates learned this from the moment they entered the order. Their earliest lessons did not involve weapons. Instead, instructors placed books before them, texts of theology, reflections on justice, interpretations of divine unity, treatises on ethics. They studied slowly, line by line, tracing the ideas that connected faith to responsibility. They learned that every action carved a mark on the world, a mark that could either defend or destroy. Within Alamut's walls, the purpose of the blade was understood long before it was touched. The Fida'i were taught that the use of force must answer three questions. Who threatens the survival of the community? When is intervention necessary? And what message must remain when the blade falls silent? These questions guided every assignment, becoming a moral compass sharpened through contemplation rather than command. This contemplative process shaped the heart of Nizari ritual. Before any Fida'i accepted a mission, he entered a period of reflection. Sometimes it lasted days, sometimes weeks. He examined not only the target, but himself, his motives, his fears, his hopes. Teachers reminded him that acting from anger, pride, or personal grievance corrupted purpose. A mission demanded purity of intention, a willingness to serve the whole community without seeking personal glory. Loyalty, therefore, was never blind. It was built from understanding, reinforced through shared belief, and tested through inner discipline. The order did not thrive on intimidation. It thrived on unity. Instructors guided their students through debates on morality, requiring them to confront difficult questions. When is violence justified? How does one weigh the life of a tyrant against the suffering of innocent families? What burden does a guardian carry after fulfilling his task? These conversations, though heavy, shaped warriors who understood the gravity of their choices. The outside world, however, saw none of this. From beyond the mountains, observers glimpsed only the outcome, the sudden strike, the silent departure, the name of a powerful minister who fell without warning. To outsiders, the precision looked like fanaticism. To those within the fortresses, it was restraint. The Nizaris believed that unnecessary violence weakened their cause. They taught that a single misjudgment could ignite new waves of persecution. Thus, they acted with caution so rigorous that many potential missions were abandoned before they began. Their fiercest weapon was not the dagger, but the decision not to use it. This discipline touched every layer of their lives. Even meals were rituals of mindfulness. Initiates ate together in quiet reflection, reminded that community sustained them more than secrecy. Teachers emphasized that the strength of the order depended on trust, trust built not through fear, but through shared hardship and learning. Work was divided fairly. Elders read alongside novices. Meditation anchored the day. And within the libraries, scholars curated knowledge that preserved their history for a future they hoped would be less dangerous. Their moral code extended beyond their walls. When Fida'i traveled across cities and villages in disguise, they were instructed to avoid harm unless absolutely necessary. If they needed shelter, they paid for it. If they borrowed supplies, they returned them. Their instructors reminded them that the reputation of the order was shaped not only by its missions, but by the behavior of every man who carried its teachings into the world. Respect, therefore, was not a word spoken lightly. It was woven into every gesture, every silence, every decision. To violate the code was to threaten the fragile balance that kept their people alive. And for a community often surrounded by hostility, reputation was both shield and compass. Even the structure of their hierarchy reflected this philosophy. Hasan-i Sabbah, though the founder, never called himself king or prophet. He ruled not as a tyrant, but as a guide whose authority stemmed from discipline, scholarship, and perseverance. His followers admired him not because he demanded absolute obedience, but because he embodied the principles he taught. Others who rose to leadership after him continued this tradition, maintaining authority through service to the community rather than dominance over it. This approach created a remarkable cohesion inside the order. Those who trained, ate, prayed, and studied together developed a loyalty that did not need coercion. They knew the hardship their families had faced. They knew the threats that loomed beyond the mountain ridges. They understood that their survival was not guaranteed. And so their unity was not the product of enchantment or manipulation, as Western observers imagined, but of shared purpose forged through struggle. Outsiders misunderstood this unity precisely because it contrasted so sharply with the world they knew. In many medieval societies, armies fought for pay, for land, or for allegiance to a lord. Soldiers followed orders because disobedience carried punishment. The Nizaris, by contrast, followed because they believed their lives were threads in a larger tapestry. a tapestry whose survival depended on each thread holding firm. They saw themselves not as killers, but as guardians of a threatened truth. They believed that defending their community required patience, intelligence, and self-control. When they acted with full awareness of the consequences. When they refrained, it was because wisdom outweighed impulse. This restraint, invisible to their enemies, shaped the soul of the order. And so, while Crusader stories painted them as mad zealots, and rival dynasties described them as unpredictable murderers, the Nizaris continued their disciplined way of life, quietly, deliberately, and with unwavering conviction. Their rituals were not cloaked in mystery. Their loyalty was not purchased through illusions. Their courage did not spring from intoxicated visions of paradise, but from the calm knowledge that their people depended on them. Within the silent fortresses of Persia and Syria, their unseen code guided every breath. It told them when to wait, when to speak, when to act, and when to stand still. In this balance, they found strength, a strength misunderstood by the world, yet vital to their survival. For the Nizaris lived not to spread fear, but to protect a fragile community standing against forces determined to erase them. Their blade was never separate from their belief, and their belief was never separate from the moral weight of every decision. This was the heart of their brotherhood. Discipline shaped by philosophy, loyalty forged through shared purpose, and a code of restraint that allowed them to walk the line between survival and annihilation with steady, deliberate steps. Chapter 10: The Assassin Network Across Empires. As the winds of rumor carried the name of Alamut across valleys and courts, the Nizari order began to stretch its influence far beyond the spine of the Persian mountains. What began as a refuge for the hunted slowly evolved into something far larger, a network woven through cities and deserts, palaces and marketplaces, whispers and coded messages. It was not an empire of stone, nor an empire defined by borders. It was an empire of intention, held together by purpose rather than territory. And through this hidden web, the assassins demonstrated that power did not always march beneath flags. Sometimes it traveled in silence. Long before empires realized the reach of this network, the Nizaris had already planted its early roots. Hasan-i Sabbah understood that no mountain fortress, no matter how secure, could protect his people forever. Isolation offered safety, but it also risked invisibility. And in the medieval world, invisibility could be fatal. To survive, the order needed eyes in distant places, voices that could move where armies could not, and paths that could carry instructions across continents without drawing suspicion. Thus, the expansion began, measured, careful, and almost undetectable. Outposts appeared first in Persia, nestled in small villages or hidden behind the public appearances of scholars and merchants. These safe houses looked indistinguishable from the dwellings around them. A stranger passing by would see nothing unusual: a potter shaping clay, a trading stall stacked with woven rugs, a scribe copying manuscripts in a sunlit corner. But behind their ordinary fronts, these places served as anchors for the order's growing presence. Here, couriers arrived at dusk, exchanging coded messages written in subtle phrases only the trained could interpret. Here, Fida'i operatives rested before slipping quietly toward their assignments. From Persia, the network crept westward into Syria, a land torn between Crusader states, Muslim emirs, and the shifting ambitions of local warlords. In the chaos of contested borders, the Nizaris found space to operate. Fortresses like Masyaf rose as sister strongholds to Alamut, perched on cliffs with watchtowers scanning the plains below. These Syrian bases became hubs of intelligence, gathering information from merchants who crossed the region and diplomats who sought refuge within their walls. Through these outposts, the order observed movements of armies, the alliances forming in Crusader courts, and the ambitions simmering among local rulers. Mesopotamia, with its vast rivers and bustling cities, offered a different kind of opportunity. Here, intelligence flowed like water. Caravans carried news across long distances. Scholars traveled between courts. Traders moved from market to market, blending into the rhythm of daily life. The Nizaris learned to move through these channels with remarkable ease. A courier disguised as a spice merchant might leave a subtle mark on a wall, a carved symbol visible only at sunrise, signaling that a message awaited pickup. A scholar visiting a library might exchange a manuscript whose margins contained hidden instructions. In this world of coded gestures, secrecy became an art refined by necessity. The network strengthened through these quiet acts, and as it expanded, its influence began to ripple across political landscapes. Many rulers first heard of the assassins through rumor, but soon realized that the order's reach extended closer than expected. A governor who persecuted Nizari families found a warning left where only he would see it. A noble who conspired against the order discovered that his plans were known before he carried them out. These moments created a delicate equilibrium, not based on fear alone, but on the recognition that the Nizaris possessed knowledge that armies could not match. Some rulers, recognizing the value of this intelligence, sought alliances. They sent envoys to Masyaf or Alamut with offers of cooperation. They requested information on rivals or sought mediation in regional conflicts. The Nizaris did not ally with everyone, nor did they serve as mercenaries. Their decisions were guided by the survival of their people, but through selective partnerships, they gained influence in courts far from their own strongholds. A whispered warning given at the right moment could prevent war. A discreet message could expose betrayal before it unfolded. In this way, the Nizaris used information as a form of diplomacy, quiet, precise, and effective. Other rulers, intimidated by the order's reach, chose a different approach, tribute. They offered gifts, protection agreements, or political concessions in exchange for peace. These gestures were not signs of weakness, but admissions of reality. The medieval world recognized many kinds of power, military strength, religious authority, wealth, lineage. The Nizaris introduced a new form, strategic intelligence. They proved that those who controlled information could, in many ways, control the direction of history. At the heart of this network were the messengers who carried the lifelines of communication. They traveled as merchants, wandering scholars, or simple laborers. Their disguises changed with every journey. They memorized messages rather than writing them down. They used coded phrases that sounded like ordinary conversation, but carried layers of meaning understood only by their intended recipients. These couriers crossed deserts on foot, climbed mountains in harsh winters, and slipped through cities unnoticed. Their work required not only discipline, but extraordinary self-control, for a single mistake could unravel entire threads of the network. Yet despite these risks, the system endured. It endured because it did not rely on grand gestures. It thrived through consistency, the same silent movements repeated across years and regions. It thrived because each outpost, no matter how small, carried the conviction that their survival depended on unity, precision, and secrecy. And it thrived because the Nizaris believed that knowledge was not merely a tool. It was a form of protection more reliable than steel. This invisible empire, though lacking borders, possessed influence that rivaled kingdoms. It shaped negotiations, halted invasions, and revealed conspiracies. Courts learned that their secrets were rarely safe from the order's reach. Crusaders discovered that alliances formed in one region were reported quietly in another. And local rulers realized that the Nizaris could not be ignored, not because of their numbers, but because of their understanding of the political currents swirling across the Middle East. As decades passed, this network solidified into one of the most sophisticated intelligence systems of the medieval world. It functioned without bureaucracy, without maps, without written laws. Its strength came from trust, purpose, and the willingness of its members to place the community above themselves. And in this, the Nizaris revealed the deepest truth of their strategy, that an empire built on information could move through landscapes where armies faltered and reach places where power seemed untouchable. In the shadowed pathways between Persia and Syria, in the marketplaces of Mosul and Aleppo, in the silent roads stretching toward Baghdad, the Nizari network became a quiet force, not conquering land, but illuminating the hidden routes through which influence traveled. It was an empire without borders, carried not by soldiers, but by belief. an empire that endured not through domination, but through understanding. And in the end, it showed the medieval world that strength did not always wear armor. Sometimes it walked barefoot in silence, carrying nothing but intention, and that was enough to shape the course of empires. Chapter 11. Open Wars and Unseen Victories. High in the fractured landscapes of Persia and Syria, the Nizaris learned to live between the clash of empires. Their world was shaped by shadows, not banners, by strategy, not spectacle. Yet even a people who moved quietly through history could not always escape the roar of open war. Across the 12th and 13th centuries, armies descended upon their fortresses like storms rolling down from distant horizons. Seljuk sultans, Crusader lords, and rival dynasties all sought to extinguish the Nizari flame. And though these assaults threatened to break them, the Nizaris discovered a truth that carried them through each trial. Resilience could be stronger than armies, and survival itself could become a victory. The first great tests came from the Seljuks, whose rule stretched in sweeping arcs across the Middle East. Their sultans viewed the Nizaris as a thorn embedded deep within their territories, a small sect that refused submission and carved out strongholds on mountaintops the Seljuks believed they alone should command. Determined to crush this defiance, Seljuk generals marched toward Nizari fortresses with siege engines, cavalry, and the confidence of overwhelming numbers. But what they encountered defied their expectations. The Nizari strongholds were not ordinary fortifications. They clung to sheer cliffs like eagles' nests, built with precision into ridges where the mountain itself became a wall. Alamut, Masyaf, and the other redoubts controlled narrow passes and difficult approaches. Siege engines struggled on steep paths. Cavalry became useless on rocky ledges. Every step upward was contested by the harsh geometry of the land. The Nizaris understood this terrain as intimately as they understood their own breath. Seljuk troops often reached the base of these fortresses only to realize the true battle waited above, a battle against elevation, hunger, cold, and the invisible pressure of defenders who needed only to hold their ground. The Nizaris used simple tactics with devastating effect. Rolling boulders crushed siege lines. Arrows rained down with terrifying accuracy. Even silence became a weapon. Days would pass without a sound from the defenders, leaving besiegers uncertain whether they faced hundreds or only a handful. The psychological strain gnawed at morale, turning confidence into doubt. Yet the Nizaris did not rely on terrain alone. While armies pressed against their walls, their leaders reached out with diplomacy sharpened by necessity. Envoys slipped through mountain paths to negotiate with neighboring rulers, reminding them that a weakened Seljuk presence could benefit their own ambitions. In other cases, messages carried discreet warnings, hints that continuing the siege might invite targeted retaliation against those who ordered it. The Nizaris rarely threatened openly, but their reputation lent weight to every word. Time and again, Seljuk campaigns faltered. Some ended in quiet withdrawals. Others dissolved into stalemates as supplies dwindled. A few crumbled after commanders died under mysterious circumstances, leaving soldiers without leadership. For the Nizaris, these moments were victories not won through force, but through endurance, victories in which survival itself became a declaration of strength. The Crusaders presented a different challenge. Unlike the Seljuks, the Crusader lords understood little about the geography, culture, or politics of the lands they marched through. They operated according to their own rules of warfare, driven by zeal and the desire to secure footholds far from home. To them, the Nizaris were an unfamiliar presence, a group whose alliances shifted according to necessity, and whose loyalty aligned not with nations, but with survival. Some Crusader commanders tried to crush Nizari fortresses to secure safer routes for their armies. Others attacked out of fear, believing rumors that the assassins moved invisibly among their ranks. In these confrontations, the Nizaris revealed another strength: mastery of psychological warfare. Crusader camps often found themselves under pressure they could neither see nor counter. Scouts reported strange sightings in the night, solitary figures watching from distant rocks. Messages appeared where no outsider should have reached. Small signs, subtle disturbances, and the unsettling feeling of being observed eroded confidence. Fear, once seeded, spread quickly through ranks already strained by hunger, disease, and the unfamiliar climate. Sometimes the Nizaris offered warnings before conflict even began. A knife embedded in a tent pole, a symbol carved on a saddle, a whispered message delivered by someone who vanished before answering questions. These acts, though bloodless, often achieved the same result as a battlefield victory: hesitation. A lord uncertain of his security rarely charged into mountainous terrain where every boulder might hide a defender. But when open war did ignite, the Nizaris proved they could fight with fierce efficiency. Their warriors knew every ridge and hidden path. They ambushed small units, disrupted supply lines, and forced larger armies into positions where neither retreat nor advance was easy. They fought not to conquer, but to wear down, to remind the invaders that this land did not welcome them. Still, not all battles ended in triumph. There were sieges that strained the Nizari defenses, assaults that broke through outer walls, and strongholds that fell under the sheer weight of numbers. But even in defeat, the Nizaris preserved what mattered most: their leadership, their knowledge, and the core of their community. When a fortress became impossible to hold, its defenders withdrew silently through mountain passages known only to them, carrying manuscripts, relics, and the memory of their teachings. These strategic retreats bewildered their enemies. Crusaders often captured empty halls. Seljuk generals found fortresses abandoned yet intact, as though the defenders had vanished into air. The Nizaris understood that stone was replaceable. People were not. Their mission depended not on territory, but on continuity. And so they preserved the heart of their order again and again, even when forced from the places they had built. This paradox, losing ground yet retaining strength, defined the Nizari experience. Each confrontation reinforced a lesson that shaped their identity. Fighting on the world's terms, with armies and open fields, would always end in disaster. Fighting on their own terms, however, allowed them to survive storms that should have overwhelmed them. Their greatest victories came not from destroying enemies, but from refusing to be destroyed. They proved that resilience could carve its own path through history, a path where endurance mattered more than conquest, and where the ability to adapt carried more force than numbers. The Nizaris did not measure triumph by land gained, but by lives saved and teachings preserved. Their power lay not in overwhelming strength, but in outlasting those who sought to erase them. In the end, the open wars they faced revealed the core of their identity: a community that thrived not through domination, but through defiance, a people who learned to stand firm even when surrounded, a brotherhood whose quiet resolve echoed louder than the clash of steel. For in resilience, they found their true power, a power invisible to armies, yet strong enough to carry them through centuries of upheaval. Chapter 12. The Mongol Storm Sweeps the Mountains. Before the Mongols arrived, the Nizaris had weathered storms that would have shattered other nations. They had survived the Seljuks, clashed with Crusaders, and outmaneuvered rival dynasties. They had endured sieges, betrayals, and isolation. Yet nothing in their long struggle could prepare them for the force that now rolled across Asia, a force so vast, so merciless, that the chronicles of the age struggled to describe it. When the Mongol Empire turned its gaze toward the mountains of Persia, the Nizaris found themselves standing before a tide that did not negotiate, did not hesitate, and did not stop. The Mongols moved like a living tempest, their cavalry stretched across horizons. Their arrows fell like storms that swallowed sunlight. Cities that had stood for centuries crumbled in days. Kingdoms that believed themselves too large to fail vanished beneath hooves and fire. This was not a campaign. It was an unraveling of worlds. And when Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis and commander of the empire's southwestern armies, prepared to subdue Persia, the Nizaris knew the storm would eventually climb their mountains. In the early years of Mongol expansion, Nizari spies tracked the movements of these distant warriors. They heard stories of cities obliterated without mercy, of rulers bound in chains, of libraries burned until their ashes drifted for miles. Yet these accounts felt almost unreal, devastating, yes, but far away. The mountains had always served as a shield. Now, however, distance meant little. Mongol campaigns moved with a precision that rivaled the Nizari's own. And as Hulagu advanced westward, fortress after fortress fell beneath an iron logic: submit or vanish. And the Mongols reached Persian territory, the first clashes with the Nizaris began. The Brotherhood did what they had always done: they resisted strategically. They used the landscape to their advantage, striking swiftly at supply caravans, disrupting lines of communication, and retreating before Mongol scouts could fix their positions. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the mountains might slow the storm. But the Mongols were unlike any enemy the Nizaris had ever faced. They adapted quickly. They studied terrain with the patience of hunters, and above all, they moved without fear of hardship. One of the first major targets was the fortress of Meymandiz, a stronghold carved into cliffs so sheer it seemed impossible to take. The Nizaris fortified it with determination, storing supplies and preparing for a long siege. But when Hulagu's forces arrived, they brought something new to the region: heavy siege machines shipped from far corners of the empire. Engines capable of hurling stones that shattered walls built to defy entire kingdoms. With terrifying precision, these machines thundered against the mountains. The Nizaris held their ground as long as they could, but after days of relentless assault, Meymandiz fell. Its defenders were killed, taken prisoner, or forced into retreat. The message was clear: even the strongest mountains could crack beneath the weight of Mongol iron. News of this defeat traveled swiftly to Alamut, the heart of the Nizari world. For generations, Alamut had stood untouched, protected by cliffs and vigilance. It had been a sanctuary of learning, a stronghold of philosophy, a symbol of endurance. To imagine it under siege felt unthinkable. Yet as Hulagu's armies approached, the Nizaris understood what was coming. They prepared their defenses with solemn resolve, knowing that this time the enemy outside their gates was not driven by politics or rivalry, but by a vision of conquest that allowed no space for negotiation. When the Mongols surrounded Alamut, the very air changed. Their encampments stretched across hillsides like dark constellations. Their banners snapped in the wind. Siege engines rolled into place beneath watchful commanders. The Nizaris reinforced their walls, carried water to storage rooms, and gathered in prayer. They were guardians facing the greatest test in their history, a test not of strategy, but of endurance before overwhelming force. The siege began with volleys of firestones that arced across the sky like falling stars. Each strike sent tremors through the fortress. The Mongols advanced methodically, constructing ramps where cliffs were too narrow for siege towers, cutting off escape routes, and watching the defenders with the cold patience of predators. Days stretched into weeks. Food dwindled. Arrows grew scarce. The Nizaris, exhausted yet unwavering, continued to resist, holding to the belief that resolve could outlast brutality. But resolve, no matter how fierce, cannot stop mountains from cracking. When a section of Alamut's outer defenses gave way, Mongol troops surged forward. The Nizaris fought with everything they had, not to win, but to protect their people long enough to preserve something of their legacy. Women and scholars were hidden in tunnels. Manuscripts were smuggled out under nightfall. Knowledge, not stone, became their priority. Then came the final breach. Mongol soldiers poured into Alamut's courtyards. Flames rose where libraries once stood. The gardens, tended for generations, were trampled. Towers collapsed beneath the weight of invaders. And in the heart of the fortress, centuries of wisdom manuscripts copied with devotion, philosophical treatises, scientific texts, went up in smoke. It was the Brotherhood's darkest hour. Across Persia, other Nizari fortresses met similar fates. Some were razed entirely. Others were abandoned after desperate evacuations. A few resisted until the last defender fell. The Mongol storm did not leave survivors to rebuild. It swallowed everything in its path: culture, memory, heritage, and hope. Yet even amid destruction, something extraordinary endured. The Nizari leadership, though battered, survived. Scholars escaped with fragments of texts. Families dispersed into distant regions, carrying their teachings with them. Hidden communities preserved memories the Mongols could not burn. And in the decades that followed, these remnants slowly knit themselves into a new survival. The Mongol storm had swept the mountains clean of stone. but it could not extinguish what lived in the hearts of the faithful. For in the ashes of Alamut, a new truth took shape. The resilience of the Brotherhood did not rest on fortresses, libraries, or gardens. It rested on the conviction that ideas could outlive destruction, that identity could endure even when the world collapsed, and that no empire, no matter how vast, could erase a people who carried their knowledge not only in texts, but in memory, devotion, and spirit. Chapter 13. Survival in the Ashes of Alamut. When Alamut fell, it seemed to many that the Nizari story had reached its final chapter. The Mongol storm left the mountains charred and emptied, the libraries reduced to drifting ash, and the strongholds that had once defied sultans and crusaders shattered into broken stone. The empire of silence and precision, which had haunted the ambitions of kings for more than a century, appeared extinguished beneath the hooves of Hulagu Khan's cavalry. But history often moves in quiet ways, and the survival of a people does not always announce itself with banners. Sometimes it begins in the smallest embers, embers guarded by those who refuse to let memory die. In the ruins of their mountain fortresses, the Nizaris did not linger. They moved swiftly, scattering across valleys, deserts, forests, and distant trade routes. Families fled under night skis, traveling in small groups that vanished like smoke into unfamiliar landscapes. Leaders escaped through routes long prepared for a day they hoped would never come. Together they carried not weapons or treasures, but something far more precious. Fragments of manuscripts, verses committed to memory, teachings whispered from one generation to the next. These were the seeds from which identity might one day rise again. Their dispersal created a quiet diaspora stretching across Persia, Syria, Central Asia, and even into the Indian subcontinent. In remote valleys, villagers hid Nizari survivors behind walls of hospitality and silence. In bustling trade cities, former couriers blended into markets as artisans, scribes, and merchants. The Mongols believed they had destroyed the order completely. What they did not understand was that the Nizari strength had never been rooted in stone. It had always been rooted in people. Those who fled carried with them the memory of Alamut, the feel of its cold stone corridors, the echo of prayers in its courtyards, the scent of its gardens touched by mountain winds. Memory became a sanctuary no invader could burn. Parents taught children the names of lost fortresses as though reciting a lineage. Elders recounted the histories of scholars who once studied beneath Alamut's lamps. Even the rituals of meditation, discipline, and ethical reflection survived, practiced in rooms lit by a single flame. Yet survival was not simply a matter of remembrance. It required adaptation, an ability the Nizaris had demonstrated for generations. In the aftermath of the Mongol devastation, they rebuilt their networks in secrecy, far from the eyes of the new rulers who now controlled their lands. Small cells of communication slowly rekindled across regions. Disguised messengers once again traveled as traders or scholars. Hidden sanctuaries took root in valleys untouched by Mongol patrols. These networks were fragile at first, nothing like the expansive system that had once connected Alamut to distant cities. But they were steady, patient, and determined. Without fortresses, the Nizaris learned to live within the societies surrounding them, adopting local customs while preserving inner traditions. In some places, they blended into merchant guilds. In others, they gained influence as healers, scholars, or advisors. Their strength became less visible but more flexible. Instead of defending stone walls, they defended knowledge, identity, and the belief that their community still had purpose in a world transformed by conquest. Leadership, too, adapted. The imams who survived the fall of Alamut guided their people not from citadels, but from hidden residences, traveling quietly and speaking only with trusted followers. Their authority was no longer symbolized by visible power, but by endurance, the ability to navigate danger without surrendering the essence of who they were. Through coded messages and cautious gatherings, they restored a sense of unity to a community now spread across great distances. Despite the scale of their loss, the Nizaris refused to yield to despair. They understood that identity does not vanish simply because its physical home is destroyed. In the evenings, in concealed rooms lit by oil lamps, elders taught children the stories of past sacrifices. They spoke of the Fida'i whose discipline had once protected their people. They recalled the philosophical teachings of Alamut's libraries, emphasizing the importance of intellect and spiritual clarity. Through these teachings, the past remained alive, not as nostalgia, but as guidance for a new chapter. Across the lands once touched by the Nizari network, rumors persisted. Some believed the assassins had been annihilated entirely. Others whispered that a few survived, invisible yet aware, waiting for the moment to rise again. These rumors served the Nizaris well. Ambiguity became a shield. Enemies hesitated to press too hard against communities that might still be connected to an unseen force. And though the Nizaris no longer carried out the missions that had once shaped the politics of empires, their reputation endured like a long shadow across the imagination of rulers. Yet within the diaspora, the Nizaris did not cling to violence. They shifted away from the methods that had defined their earlier centuries. The Mongol devastation had taught them that survival required new forms of strength. Instead of striking from the shadows, they learned to cultivate alliances quietly, to build influence through trade and scholarship, and to strengthen bonds within their dispersed communities. Violence had never been their goal, only a tool shaped by necessity. Now that necessity had changed, and so did their methods. In this transformation, they discovered something profound. The resilience forged in the mountains was not bound to the mountains. The principles that once held Alamut together, discipline, loyalty, intellectual rigor, and devotion, could thrive anywhere. Whether in a village nestled between wheat fields or a caravanserai along a distant trade route, the essence of the brotherhood continued. Generations passed, and the Nizaris slowly re-emerged, no longer as the feared assassins of medieval chronicles, but as a renewed community shaped by endurance. They rebuilt centers of learning, though smaller and less conspicuous than Alamut. They strengthened ties with local populations, integrating while preserving distinct traditions. They found new leaders who guided them with wisdom rather than secrecy. And gradually, they reclaimed a sense of stability the Mongols had tried to erase. Their survival became a testament to the power of quiet perseverance. They had lost fortresses, libraries, gardens, and the physical heart of their world. Yet the flame of identity, carried in memory, guarded through silence, woven into every lesson passed to a child, endured. Hulagu Khan's armies believed they had crushed the Nizari order completely. But in the scattered families hiding in valleys, in the whispered teachings passed in secret, in the resilience of a people who refused to forget, something continued. A spark, a thread, a pulse. For the brotherhood that once shaped the fear of kings did not die in the ashes of Alamut. It transformed. It scattered like seeds on the wind, rooting itself in new soils. And through silence, memory, and unbroken will, it kept alive a flame the Mongols believed extinguished, a flame that would burn quietly through the centuries, waiting for its time to rise again. Chapter 14. From Medieval Shadows to Modern Misconceptions. As centuries unfurled and empires rose and fell, the world transformed in ways the mounting guardians of Alamut could never have imagined. New religions spread across continents. Gunpowder replaced the bow. Nations replaced sultanates. Maps redrew themselves again and again. The Mongol storm faded into memory, and with time, the medieval world that had once feared the Nizaris dissolved into dust. Yet one thing endured, not their libraries, not their fortresses, not even their political influence, but a single word carried across ages: assassin. It traveled far from its origins, drifting into languages that had never known the scent of Persian cedars or the silence of Syrian ridges. It crossed oceans, leapt into literature, and embedded itself in the vocabulary of the modern world. But the word arrived stripped of history, divorced from context, emptied of the spiritual and philosophical foundation that once defined it. What had once been the name of a people fighting for survival became a universal synonym for murder. To understand how this transformation occurred, we must return to the spaces between fact and myth, the spaces shaped by Western chroniclers, travelers, and storytellers who misunderstood a world they glimpsed only from the outside. When Europeans encountered the Nizaris during the Crusades, they stepped into a culture unlike anything they knew. The assassins operated with a precision unfamiliar to the battlefield, guided by motives that could not be captured in a single line of scripture or politics. To crusaders used to armies clashing in the open, this subtlety felt otherworldly, and where understanding fails, imagination often fills the void. Over time, the old man of the mountain grew into a villainous archetype. The Fida'i became puppets controlled by sorcery. Initiation rites were embellished with narcotics, illusions, and scenes of paradise conjured to manipulate the faithful. These accounts, carried by merchants and adventurers, were repeated across Europe, with every retelling more theatrical than the last. The result was a legend so vivid that even as centuries passed, it overshadowed the truth completely. Medieval chroniclers wrote with the urgency of entertainment rather than accuracy. Marco Polo, hearing stories second-hand, embellished them into a tapestry of fantasy. Writers in European courts transformed the Nizaris into mysterious figures who carried daggers dipped in poison, who feared nothing, who obeyed without question. As these stories spread, the historical Nizaris, a persecuted community trying to survive the shifting brutality of empires, were replaced by characters pulled from imagination. In the early modern period, this mythology solidified even further. Assassin entered Western languages, no longer referring to a specific sect of Shia Muslims, but to anyone who killed for political or personal gain. The deeper meanings, the ethical debates, the spiritual reflections, the painful decisions that guided Nizari actions were lost. The world forgot the debates held in Alamut's courtyards, the teachings preserved in hidden manuscripts, the moral codes that demanded restraint long before violence. All that remained was a shadow, dangerous, uncanny, and stripped of nuance. As time marched on, plays, novels, and later films magnified these distortions. The Nizaris were recast as exotic villains lurking in palaces, as hypnotized killers sent by tyrannical masters, as agents of fear living outside the laws of humanity. Even academic circles struggled to separate truth from centuries of exaggeration. The myths had rooted themselves too deeply. They had become more familiar, more dramatic, more appealing than the reality of a community enduring persecution and navigating impossible choices. Yet beneath these distortions, the real story continued quietly, carried in the living traditions of the Nizari Ismailis, the modern descendants of the medieval order. Over the centuries, they evolved into a community devoted not to political assassination, but to spiritual leadership, education, and social welfare. Their imams guided them into new eras, far removed from the violence that had once defined their survival. They built schools, hospitals, and networks of humanitarian relief. They preserved scholarship, philosophy, and ethical reflection. Their history, once overshadowed by the walls of Alamut, now thrived in classrooms and community centers across continents. But the word had taken on a life of its own. Assassin entered the modern world with a meaning entirely detached from the people who once bore the name. Political killings, criminal acts, even fictional villains in novels and video games adopted the title, stretching it into a shape unrecognizable to its origins. And as this evolution occurred, the truth risked fading even further into obscurity. Yet history has a way of preserving echoes. Scholars revisited forgotten manuscripts. Archaeologists uncovered remnants of Nizari fortresses. Communities whose roots stretched back to those scattered after Alamut carried memories in prayer, tradition, and identity. Through these threads, the deeper narrative began resurfacing, a story not of mystical assassins controlled by sorcery, but of a minority sect navigating centuries of danger with intelligence, discipline, and resolute conviction. The modern world, shaped by its own fears and narratives, often fails to see the human side of medieval history. It is easier to embrace a legend of shadowy killers than to understand a community forced into impossible decisions by political oppression. It is simpler to repeat exaggerated tales than to acknowledge the ethical frameworks that guided the Nizaris or the compassion that shaped their internal life. But to look closer is to see a different truth altogether. The Nizaris were survivors long before they were legends. They were thinkers who debated the nature of justice, guardians who defended a threatened faith, families who preserved their culture through centuries of displacement. Their actions, so often judged without context, arose from a world where persecution narrowed the path of survival to a razor's edge. And so, as the modern world continues to use the word assassin, it echoes a history that has been misremembered, simplified, transformed into fiction. But beneath that single, distorted term lies a legacy far richer than myth, a legacy of endurance, adaptation, and quiet strength. The Nizaris walked through centuries of turmoil with a combination of intellect, discipline, and devotion that deserves to be recalled with depth rather than caricature. For the shadows of the medieval world cast long silhouettes across time, and behind the silhouette of the assassin lies the silhouette of a people who chose survival when the world offered them nothing but danger, a people whose true story waits patiently beneath the myths, ready to be seen again. Chapter 15. The Last Echoes of the Silent Creed. In the quiet places where history settles into dust, the story of the assassin order lingers like a fading breath. Their fortresses have long since crumbled into broken teeth along forgotten ridges. Their libraries lie buried beneath centuries of soil, their ink dissolved by rain and time. What remains are fragments, scattered manuscripts, ruins embraced by moss, and stories passed through generations like faint embers carefully shielded from the wind. And yet, even in this scattered form, the silent creed has not vanished. It endures, not as a force of shadow and steel, but as a whisper of memory carried into the modern world. Today, the original Nizari assassins exist only in the remnants of their history. Archaeologists climb the skeletal remains of Alamut and its sister fortresses, tracing the outlines of towers where scholars once debated theology and guardians once watched the valleys below. Historians pore over fragile manuscripts saved from the Mongol storm, reconstructing ideas once thought lost forever. In these fragments, the past speaks, not with the violence of medieval myth, but with the quiet dignity of a community that endured chaos with discipline and faith. The modern Ismaili community, spiritual descendants of the same line that once guided Alamut, continues to shape its identity far from the turmoil that defined the medieval centuries. Their world today is one of education, humanitarian service, and global engagement, a transformation that reflects survival, adaptation, and renewal. They do not carry blades or build mountain fortresses. They follow a tradition centered on ethics, knowledge, and communal strength. And in their devotion, scholars see a faint outline of the philosophical heart that once beat within the old order, the belief that the mind and spirit are the first defenses against darkness. Yet outside these communities, the myth of the assassins persists, a stubborn echo shaped by centuries of misunderstanding. Modern books, films, and games often resurrect the legend of hooded killers leaping from rooftops, bound by enchantment or secret rites. These images capture imagination, but they obscure the deeper truth. They reduce a complex chapter of history to spectacle. They echo the fears of medieval chroniclers more than the lived experiences of the Nizaris themselves. Historians working today labor to unwind these knots of fiction. They trace the origins of exaggerated tales, uncovering how Crusader anxiety, European curiosity, and centuries of retelling turned human beings into symbols of terror. In their place, scholars reveal something far more compelling, a community navigating impossible pressures, forced into secrecy not by sorcery, but by survival. This new understanding does not erase the difficult moments of Nizari history, but it places them within the context of an age shaped by conquest, persecution, and shifting political landscapes. Through these efforts, a more nuanced narrative emerges, one where the Nizaris are neither ghosts nor demons, but individuals shaped by a world that offered few safe paths. They were farmers defending their homes, scholars protecting their manuscripts, families trying to preserve their identity amid collapsing empires. They wielded intelligence and precision because brute force was a luxury they could not afford. They acted with restraint because destruction carried unbearable consequences. Their story is not a celebration of violence. It is a meditation on survival. Standing among the ruins of their former strongholds, it becomes clear that the silence they embraced was not emptiness. It was protection, philosophy, and resilience bound together. The stones of Alamut, though weathered, still hold the outline of gardens where initiates once walked in contemplation. The foundations of Masyaf still echo with the memory of leaders who met emissaries from empires with a mixture of firmness and diplomacy. These ruins remind us that history is often more human, more fragile, and more profound than the legends woven in its name. The last echoes of the silent creed speak to a universal truth, that stories grow in the spaces where knowledge fades. When the past becomes distant, imagination fills the gaps with shadows. The Nizaris suffered from this more than most. Their secrecy, born from necessity, made them vulnerable to accusation. Their moral code, misunderstood by outsiders, was reshaped into mythology. Their isolated fortresses, admired by travelers, became the stage for tales of sorcery. In time, these myths grew louder than reality. But now, centuries after their fall, the tide begins to turn. Scholars, archaeologists, and communities are reclaiming the narrative. They seek to understand the Nizaris not as legend, but as people striving to protect a threatened faith, people negotiating alliances in a fractured world, people who believed that knowledge was as vital as any fortress wall. The rediscovery of their history dismantles old fears and illuminates the quiet brilliance that once guided their actions. And as the modern world revisits their story, something remarkable happens. The myths do not disappear entirely, they persist as cultural echoes. Yet they gradually give way to understanding. The assassins become more than the shadows depicted in fiction. They become a reflection of how history remembers those who stand at the margins of power, how easily complexity becomes caricature, and how deeply human resilience can shape even the darkest chapters. In this recognition lies the final legacy of the Silent Creed. It teaches us that truth often hides beneath layers of inherited stories. It reminds us that the past is rarely as simple as the legends we repeat, and it invites us, gently, insistently, to question the narratives handed down through generations. Today, the Nizaris no longer walk as Fida'i or guardians of mountain fortresses, but their spirit lingers in the memory of perseverance, in the commitment to learning that defines their descendants, and in the historical threads that scholars continue to unravel. The world that once feared them now seeks to understand them, and in that shift, the last echoes of their creed take on new meaning. For their story does not end in the ruins of Alamut or the ashes left by Mongol fire. It endures in the quiet resolve of a people who refused to disappear, a people who survived centuries of upheaval, carrying their truth forward even when the world misunderstood them. In the end, the Silent Creed whispers a final lesson. That legends may fade, but the humanity beneath them remains. Conclusion, where shadows become memory. Across the long arc of history, the story of the assassin order drifts like a shadow across shifting landscapes, stretched, reshaped, and often misunderstood. What began as a community seeking refuge from persecution became, through centuries of war and rumor, one of the most mythologized brotherhoods in the medieval world. Their name traveled far beyond the mountains of Persia and Syria, carried not by their own voices, but by the tongues of enemies, travelers, and storytellers who saw only fragments of who they truly were. And yet, when we follow their path from its origins to its collapse, a richer, quieter truth begins to emerge. The heart of their story does not lie in the legends of supernatural assassins or poisoned blades. It lies in a minority community struggling to survive in a world dominated by empires far larger than themselves. Their faith set them apart. Their persecution shaped their decisions. Their isolation pushed them toward methods misunderstood by those outside their walls. And in this struggle, they forged a way of life rooted in discipline, intellect, and devotion, not madness, not sorcery, but purpose formed under pressure. From the moment Hasan-i Sabbah claimed Alamut and transformed it into a sanctuary, the Nizaris showed that survival could grow from knowledge as much as from strategy. Their fortresses became places of learning, their libraries filled with manuscripts that carried centuries of thought. Young initiates studied theology, mathematics, languages, and ethics, before they ever learned to hold a blade. Their community valued reflection over impulse, intention over chaos. Even their most feared defenders, the Fida'i, acted with deliberation shaped by meditation and ethical inquiry. To them, violence was not the center of their identity. It was a burden taken only when all other paths had closed. Yet the world watching from outside their mountains rarely saw this depth. Crusaders, overwhelmed by unfamiliar cultures, shaped the Nizaris into creatures of fear. European chroniclers, hungry for stories that would captivate distant courts, replaced nuance with spectacle. They wrote of enchanted gardens, mindless followers, and an old man of the mountain whose command reached beyond reason. These tales, magnified through centuries of repetition, hardened into myth until the real Nizaris disappeared beneath layers of fiction. Then came the Mongol storm, a force that erased kingdoms and swallowed civilizations whole. Their arrival marked the darkest hour for the Nizaris. Fortress by fortress fell beneath an empire that recognized no compromise. Alamut burned, manuscripts dissolved into smoke, gardens were trampled, libraries emptied, towers shattered. The physical world the Nizaris had built with such care was torn down in a single generation. To those who witnessed the destruction, it must have seemed like the definitive end of a people long feared and rarely understood. Yet history often preserves more than stone. In the ashes of Alamut, the Nizaris scattered but did not vanish. Families carried their teachings into hidden valleys. Scholars preserved their philosophy in memory when books no longer survived. Quiet communities reformed across Persia, Syria, Central Asia, and India. Their methods changed, but their identity endured. Over time, they rebuilt not fortresses, but networks of learning, community, and spiritual continuity that would evolve into the modern Ismaili tradition. Today, centuries after their strongholds crumbled, the legacy of the medieval Nizaris lives on not in daggers or dramatic legends, but in the resilience of a people who transformed survival into renewal. The modern Ismaili community, guided by its imams, is defined by education, humanitarian work, and a commitment to ethical living, a far cry from the caricatures shaped by medieval fear. Their story is one of continuity, not violence, of cultural endurance, not shadows. Meanwhile, historians continue the painstaking work of untangling myth from reality. Through manuscripts recovered from unexpected places, through archaeological studies of ruined fortresses, through comparisons of chroniclers' accounts, they reveal a brotherhood far more complex than the stories that once haunted European imagination. These revelations do not erase the difficult decisions the Nizaris made, nor do they deny the moments of conflict that defined their era. But they return humanity to a people long trapped beneath myth. And so, as we stand at the end of their story, we see something deeper than legends. We see individuals navigating a world of giants, carving out survival where survival seemed impossible. We see a community whose silence was not sinister, but protective. We see resilience shaped by necessity, not by darkness. Their tale reminds us that history is often formed not only by kings, armies, and grand victories, but by those who survive in the margins, those who move quietly, think deeply, and refuse to be erased. It urges us to listen more carefully to the whispers that drift through time, for in those whispers we often find truths that echo longer than myths. In the end, the assassin order's legacy rests not in fear, but in endurance. Their shadows have become memory, and within that memory lies a reminder that even in the most turbulent chapters of history, humanity persists, quietly, resiliently, and with a depth that legend alone can never fully capture.